What if the very thing someone laughs at becomes the weapon that unmasks their deepest secret? Imagine stepping into a world where wealth commands respect, where arrogance builds walls higher than any skyscraper, and where one single voice, humble, quiet, almost invisible, has the power to bring that world crashing down. Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover may surprise you more than you think. In a mansion on the Upper East Side of New York, every corner gleamed with luxury. The marble floors reflected the golden chandeliers. The grand piano stood untouched in the living room, and the guests spoke in hushed tones of deals worth millions. At the center of it all was Richard Thompson, a man whose fortune stretched further than the skyline. He believed money could buy him anything: status, influence, even respect. What he couldn't buy, he dismissed as worthless: faith, humility, compassion. Those were things for the poor, for the weak. At least, that's what he told himself. But that night, amid the glitter and chatter, a presence entered the room that didn't fit his carefully crafted image. Mary Collins, the maid, came quietly, almost blending into the background. Her uniform was simple, her shoes worn from years of walking to and from buses and subway trains. In her hands, she carried a small, leather-bound Bible. Its edges frayed, the pages softened from countless turns. It looked like it had lived many lives before reaching this room. To her, it wasn't just a book. It was a lifeline, a compass in a world that often overlooked people like her. Richard noticed immediately, and instead of ignoring it, he made it a spectacle. He chuckled, his voice echoing across the hall. "Really, Mary? You bring that into my house? Do you think words on old paper will change anything here? This is a place of money, not fairy tales." His guests laughed, some uncomfortably, others in cruel solidarity. The atmosphere shifted, and all eyes turned toward the maid who dared to bring faith into the palace of arrogance. Now let me ask you, have you ever seen someone humiliated for holding on to what they believe in? Maybe you've been through something similar, where the thing that gave you strength was mocked by those who thought they had everything. Stay with me, because this story is not just about a Bible or a wealthy man. It's about the collision between arrogance and truth, between hidden guilt and fearless courage. Mary didn't flinch. She didn't lower her head, didn't hide the book, didn't rush out of the room in shame. Instead, she pressed the Bible closer to her chest, as if drawing energy from its very core. Her silence was unsettling. It wasn't weakness, it was strength. And in that moment, something in Richard's laughter faltered. He had crushed countless rivals in boardrooms, silenced competitors with money and power, but he wasn't prepared for resistance that didn't come with a price tag. What you're about to see is how a simple verse, one read in a trembling yet unyielding voice, can pierce through the armor of arrogance, because behind Richard's polished image, behind the expensive suit and the smug smile, lay a secret he had buried for years. And Mary, with nothing more than her worn Bible and unshakable faith, was about to bring it into the light. The room grew colder. Conversations stopped. Mary opened the book, her fingers resting on pages she knew by heart. The air seemed to still, as if everyone sensed that something greater than wealth or status was about to be revealed. And in that silence, where money held no power and pride had no shield, the first words of the verse began to rise. Her voice trembled at first, like the sound of a fragile string pulled too tight, but then it grew steadier, filling the room in a way no chandelier could outshine. Every word from that Bible carried a weight that none of Richard's millions could buy. You could almost feel the tension. Guests who seconds ago had been laughing now sat in silence, watching a maid challenge a millionaire with nothing more than faith. And maybe, as you're listening to this, you've felt something similar before. Have you ever been in a situation where someone tried to make you feel small, only for your truth, or even just your quiet courage, to be stronger than their arrogance? If this moment resonates with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Share your feelings, your experiences, or even just a simple reflection. Your words matter more than you imagine, and they help create a space here where we can all connect through stories like this. And while you're here, don't forget, when you like this video, it tells me that these stories are reaching you in the right way. It also helps this channel grow, bringing these lessons of humility, justice, and redemption to more people who might need to hear them today. And if you feel that this kind of storytelling is worth continuing, subscribing is the best way to stay with me on this journey. Every subscription is like saying, yes, I believe in these stories too, because in the end, this channel isn't just about millionaires and maids or arrogance and faith. It's about us, about the values we carry, the lessons we share, and the community we're building together. So take a moment. Leave your voice in the comments, press that like button, and join me by subscribing. Your presence here is what makes all the difference. Now let's return to that silent room where Mary's verse is about to uncover the truth Richard has tried so hard to bury. Richard Thompson's life was a performance staged on the grandest of platforms. From the outside, he looked like a man who had mastered every move in the game of success. His penthouse on Fifth Avenue overlooked Central Park like a throne surveying its kingdom, and every morning he reminded himself that he had built it all from nothing but ambition and calculation. His suits were hand-tailored in Italy. His watch a limited edition timepiece only a few in the world could own, and his car, a black Bentley, glided through the city streets as though the traffic itself moved aside in reverence. People didn't see Richard as just another wealthy man. They saw him as untouchable, a figure of authority who had the power to dictate not just deals, but destinies. But if you followed him behind the glass doors of those skyscrapers, you'd notice something else. The sharp words he used in meetings, the impatient sighs when an assistant fumbled, the way he dismissed anyone who spoke of principles or ethics. It all came from a place of disdain for what he considered weakness. Faith, kindness, humility, those words had no currency in his world. He believed life was about control, about mastering appearances, about ensuring no one could ever pierce the armor he had carefully built. At a board meeting not long before that fateful evening, Richard had silenced a younger partner who dared suggest that the company should invest in community programs. The man had spoken with conviction, reminding everyone that even corporations had a responsibility toward society. Richard leaned back in his chair, eyes cold, and said, "We're not in the business of saving souls. We're in the business of making money. If you want charity, go to church. If you want power, stay at this table." Those words captured his mindset. To him, success was about dominance, not service, about numbers, not people. His arrogance wasn't born overnight. Years earlier, Richard grew up in a modest neighborhood of Queens. His father worked 2 jobs. His mother stretched every dollar to put food on the table. Richard hated those days. He despised the embarrassment of wearing second-hand clothes to school, the humiliation of being teased for never going on vacations, the sting of hearing his mother whisper prayers late at night when bills piled higher than their hopes. He vowed, as a boy lying on a thin mattress in a shared room, that one day he would never need anyone or their God to survive. He would build a life where money was the only answer, where faith had no place. And in many ways, he succeeded. By his 30s, he had flipped his first company for millions. By his 40s, he was a household name in finance. Magazines called him a visionary, networks invited him as a guest speaker, and universities lined up to feature him at commencement ceremonies. But what those glossy articles didn't show was the man who couldn't sit still in silence, who feared what might rise to the surface if he stopped moving, if he allowed space for reflection. Richard's disdain for faith wasn't just intellectual, it was emotional. Every time he saw someone praying, every time he heard the word hope, it dragged him back to those nights when his family relied on a faith he believed had failed them. To admit faith had any power would be to admit that his parents weren't foolish, that maybe love and humility carried a Strength he couldn't measure. That idea terrified him, so he laughed at it, buried it, crushed it under the weight of his accomplishments. Yet for all his wealth, Richard carried a hidden truth. There was something in his past, something buried beneath layers of deals and distractions that gnawed at him. He had spent years ensuring no one could ever discover it. Secrets have a way of shaping us, and his shaped him into a man who fought constantly to maintain control. That secret was the reason. His smile never quite reached his eyes, the reason he snapped at the smallest inconvenience, the reason he filled his life with noise, with parties, with relentless schedules. He feared silence because silence might bring the truth too close. At social gatherings, Richard played the role of the untouchable host. Guests admired his art collection, his shelves lined with first-edition books he'd never read, his wine cellar curated by experts. But if you listened closely, you might hear the hollow echo in his laughter. He could buy admiration, but he could never buy peace. And the more he tried to bury the past, the heavier it pressed against him. That night in the mansion, when Mary entered holding her worn Bible, Richard's reaction wasn't just arrogance, it was defense. "What is that supposed to do here?" he scoffed, pointing at the book. "Do you think stories written thousands of years ago will solve anything today? Look around you. This is reality. This is power. That book is nothing but ink and superstition." His words cut through the room, followed by uneasy chuckles from guests who weren't sure whether to laugh or remain silent. Mary looked up at him, her gaze calm yet piercing. For a moment, Richard felt something stir inside him. An unease he quickly disguised with another smirk. He told himself she was just a maid, just another person too simple to understand how the world really worked. But deep down, her presence unsettled him in a way he couldn't explain. Richard prided himself on decisions. Every move he made, from mergers to investments, was calculated. But here was a woman whose decision to bring faith into his house challenged his entire identity. Her mindset was foreign to him. She seemed to draw strength from something invisible, something untouchable, something money could never purchase. And that alone made him feel exposed. There was impact in that moment, a subtle shift that others might not have noticed. Behind the polished surface of Richard's arrogance, his hidden guilt trembled. He had mocked many people before, silenced countless voices, but this felt different. The Bible she carried wasn't just a book, it was a mirror, and somewhere inside him, he feared what it might reflect back. The guests exchanged glances, whispering behind their champagne glasses. They knew Richard as a man of control, a man who could dominate any conversation, yet watching him mock a maid with such intensity felt uncomfortable. It wasn't just laughter, it was almost desperation. Richard tightened his grip on his glass, the stem pressing against his fingers. He wanted to maintain the upper hand, to remind everyone that he was untouchable. But the truth was, he wasn't laughing at Mary. He was laughing at the echo of his past, at the prayers he once heard in a dimly lit kitchen, at the memory of his mother whispering hope into the darkness. And though he didn't realize it yet, that very memory was about to collide with the present. Mary's Bible would become more than an object of mockery. It would become the voice of the silence he had avoided all his life, the voice that refused to let him hide any longer. Mary Collins was not the kind of woman who drew attention when she entered a room. She had spent her life blending into the background, moving quietly through spaces that weren't hers, caring for homes that she could never afford to own. And yet, there was something about her presence that lingered. People rarely noticed it at first, but if they watched closely, they'd see the resilience in her eyes, the quiet determination in the way she carried herself. She was not rich, not powerful by the world's standards, but she possessed something that no amount of money could buy, a sense of inner strength that came from a place far deeper than circumstance. She grew up in a small town just outside of Albany, in a neighborhood where families worked hard and prayed harder. Her father was a mechanic, her mother a waitress who, came home late at night with sore feet, but a smile that never faded. They didn't have much, but what they had was shared freely, with neighbors, with friends, with strangers who needed it more. Mary learned early that dignity wasn't tied to wealth, but to the way one treated others. She remembered her father once telling her, "Mary, you can lose every dollar in your pocket, but if you keep your faith and your kindness, you'll never be truly poor." Those words stayed with her long after his passing. Her journey to New York City was not a glamorous one. She came looking for work, not for dreams, cleaning houses, caring for children, ironing clothes that weren't hers. These were the stepping stones that paid her rent and allowed her to keep a roof over her head in a small apartment in Queens. Every day she faced the sharp contrasts of the city, skyscrapers casting shadows over worn-out buildings, wealth brushing shoulders with poverty. She had seen both sides, and it was in those spaces in between that she found her calling. She didn't see herself as just a maid. She saw herself as someone who carried light into places where it was often missing. Her Bible was her companion through it all. It wasn't just a book she carried, it was a piece of her life's journey. The leather cover was cracked, the corners bent, and inside the pages were tiny notes written in her own handwriting. Some verses were underlined, others circled, and in the margins were prayers she had scribbled. In moments of desperation, to her, the Bible was not about ritual, but about survival. It reminded her of who she was when the world tried to tell her otherwise. When she faced rejection, loneliness, or the weight of endless labor, she would open its pages and find the strength to keep going. In the grand halls of Richard Thompson's mansion, that Bible stood out like a fragile flame in the middle of a storm. Guests noticed it because it didn't belong there, at least not in their eyes. But Mary never considered leaving it behind. She once told herself, "If I walk into a place without my faith, I leave behind the best part of me." It was not defiance, but conviction, and it shaped her decisions every single day. Her appearance was modest. Her uniform was pressed but simple, her shoes practical and worn. She tied her hair back neatly, not for vanity, but for efficiency. Yet even in her simplicity, there was an elegance about her. It wasn't the elegance of pearls or diamonds, but the elegance of someone who knew exactly who she was. In a world obsessed with appearances, Mary's dignity came from her unshakable authenticity. She didn't try to impress, she simply lived in alignment with her values. Behind the scenes of her quiet exterior, though, was a life marked by trials. Mary had lost more than most people knew. Years earlier, she had been married to a man named Daniel, a construction worker who dreamed of opening his own business. They shared laughter, late-night talks, and plans for a family, but those dreams ended abruptly when an accident on a worksite claimed his life. For a time, Mary's world collapsed. She found herself alone, carrying not just grief, but the burden of survival. It was during those nights of pain that her Bible became more than a book. She remembered whispering through tears, "God, I don't know how to move forward, but please carry me through this." And somehow, he did. This loss shaped her into the woman she had become. It taught her resilience, patience, and a profound empathy for others. She didn't see arrogance and cruelty as something to fight with anger, but as wounds masked by pride. That's why, when Richard mocked her Bible, she didn't lash out. Instead, she felt an odd mix of sorrow and determination. She could see through his laughter the same emptiness she had seen in herself after Daniel's death. She knew that arrogance was often nothing more than fear in disguise. Mary's mindset was different from most people around her. She didn't measure life by what she had, but by what she gave. Her transformation from a grieving widow to a woman of quiet strength was a journey marked not by wealth, but by faith. She believed that the hidden truths people carried could either destroy them or set them free, and that sometimes all it took was the right word spoken at the right moment to shift everything. Standing there in Richard's mansion, surrounded by wealth and pride, Mary represented the exact opposite of everything he stood for. Where he saw power in possessions, she saw power in perseverance. Where he valued control, she valued surrender. Where he sought to bury his hidden guilt, she carried her scars openly, allowing them to guide her rather than silence her. And that contrast was what gave her presence such an unexpected impact. Richard may have mocked her, but deep down, the very thing he ridiculed was what made him uneasy. He sensed that she carried something he didn't have, and perhaps could never buy. And Mary, though quiet, was not blind to his discomfort. She had seen that look before in people who laughed the loudest, but were breaking inside. As she adjusted the Bible in her hands, Mary took a breath and steadied herself. The room was watching, the tension palpable. She knew this wasn't about her pride. It was about truth, and she was prepared to let that truth speak louder than any insult, louder than any fortune, louder than any mask Richard could wear. It was in that silence, as eyes moved between the powerful man and the humble maid, that something invisible began to shift. Richard's world of control was about to collide with Mary's world of faith, and the revelations that would follow could no longer be contained. The instant Richard noticed the Bible, the energy in the room shifted, like a string quartet hitting a wrong note in the middle of a flawless performance. The living room was a stage made of marble and money, glass walls reflecting the Manhattan skyline, a gallery of abstract art curated to impress, a bartender pouring 12-year-old scotch for men who measured time in quarterly returns. Mary stood near the edge of the Persian rug, the book cupped in both hands, its spine softened by years of use. Richard's gaze snapped to it with the cold precision of someone who had trained his eyes to find weaknesses in contracts, in faces, in moments. His smile thinned into a blade. "Do you really think that book has answers to life?" he said, lifting his glass in a mock toast. "Here, money solves everything." The line drew a few strained laughs, the kind that travel only as far as the corner of the mouth. It wasn't humor, it was pressure. An attempt to force the room to agree with his worldview, to make the humiliation part of the entertainment. Mary didn't retreat, though every instinct in a person used to serving might have told her to make herself smaller. She adjusted her stance instead, a subtle decision that looked like nothing, but meant everything. "It helps me choose the right words," she said softly. The words didn't ask for permission or approval. They simply arrived, steady as a heartbeat. Richard set his glass on the piano, the crystal ringing a short, sharp note. "The right words," he repeated, savoring the echo. "Mary, the right words are the ones that close deals and move markets. The right words are contracts and wire transfers, stories and verses. Those are for people who can't afford reality." He expected her to flush, to lower her eyes, to tuck the Bible away like contraband. Instead, Mary's fingers tightened around the leather cover. "Reality isn't always what money says it is," she replied, still calm. "Sometimes reality is the hidden truth you don't want to look at." A flutter passed through the guests, like a breeze slipping under a door. It wasn't that she raised her voice. She didn't have to. The courage in it created a gravity of its own. Richard felt it and moved quickly to crush it. "Hidden truth," he laughed, turning to the crowd as though inviting them to admire a curious painting. "The only truth is results, bank statements, decisions that pay off. Everything else is sentimental." He stepped closer, each polished shoe heel tapping the marble with quiet authority. "Let's be behind the scenes honest, Mary," he said. "People carry these books when they have nothing else to hold." He tapped the Bible with a single finger, then turned his hand palm up to the room. "And I, fortunately, have everything." His voice rolled like a commercial, confident, rhythmic, engineered to sell you a future. Mary's eyes didn't move from his. "You have a lot," she said, "but not everything." The stillness that followed wasn't empty. It was dense, filled with the weight of two opposing mindsets colliding. This wasn't an argument about religion for the guests. It was an uncomfortable look at the difference between display and depth, between spectacle and soul. Richard pivoted toward his guests as if to reclaim the narrative. "Ladies and gentlemen, a lesson in mindset," he announced, theatrical. "In my world, transformation looks like this: acquire, expand, dominate. In hers, transformation is, what? A feeling?" A man near the fireplace coughed into his fist. A woman glanced at Mary with a flicker of sympathy she quickly hid. Richard continued, pacing the rug, letting his monologue gather momentum. "I grew up without safety nets. I built everything you see through discipline. And decisions, not prayer, not superstition. Decisions." He let the word hang, satisfied with its sharp edges. Mary stepped forward one measured pace, the Bible rising from her chest to her chin as though it helped hold her spine straight. "Decisions shape lives," she said quietly, "but the why behind your decisions shapes your soul." The sentence was not a challenge. It drifted into the room like the scent of rain before a storm. Richard blew out a short breath, irritated that the tension was not breaking the way it always did under his script. "Soul," he repeated, tasting the word. "My company employs 32,000 people across the country. That's real impact. I make payrolls. I fund hospitals. I donate museums. If there is a soul, it's well compensated." Under the chandelier's light, you could see Mary's face. Not defiance, not fear, but a sort of clear sadness, as if she had finally found the exact place where his armor began. "Impact isn't only what you can count," she said. "It's also what you can't escape." She didn't say more, and that restraint made the sentence feel larger. Richard straightened. "Let me save you the journey, Mary," he replied, tightening the knot of his cufflinks as if sealing a point. "You're in my house, on my clock, and let's keep the revelations for Sunday morning. Tonight we're celebrating a deal that added $3 billion in value. That's the only verse that matters." He turned to the piano and struck a single key with his index. Finger, then two, then three, as if he could compose a soundtrack for his own superiority. The room gave him a polite ripple of laughter, but laughter is a fragile currency when the audience senses a crack. And there was a crack, thin as a hairline fracture in glass, right where his confidence met her composure. Mary could feel it. She wasn't trying to win. She was trying to stand. Yet standing in truth has a way of exposing what spectacle cannot cover. "I'm not here to preach," she said after a moment. "I'm here to work, but when someone tells me money solves everything, I remember what it couldn't solve." Richard's head tilted, hawk-like. "And what's that?" The question sounded like a trap, but it was really curiosity, dragged reluctantly from a place he didn't let many see. Mary's eyes flicked for a second to the window where the city glittered like a promise that always demanded more. "Grief," she said. "Loneliness. The fear that follows you home when you've done something you can't undo." The last phrase landed with a soft thud, but its echo traveled far. Richard didn't flinch, but the silence that replaced his smirk said enough. A guest shifted. A bracelet chimed. New York was still humming outside, cabs threading the avenues, but in this room, time bunched tightly, like a hand closing around a secret. He leaned in, leaving only a few inches between his tailored suit and her simple uniform. "Careful," he murmured. "Accusations aren't free." Mary shook her head. "I didn't accuse you." Her voice was softer now, the kind of softness that invites, not surrenders. "I'm talking about people, all of us, the parts we hide." Richard straightened, as if lifting himself out of a memory. "What we hide is our own business," he replied. "That's how adults live. We make choices, we carry them, we move on." He sounded almost persuasive, the way one might talk to himself in a mirror on a morning he did not want to face. Mary's thumb smoothed the edge of a page. "You can move on," she said, "but not always forward." The sentence did not accuse, it described. He forced a small laugh. "You'd be surprised how far forward a private jet can go." She looked at him then, with a patience that felt older than the room, older than his wealth, older than his arguments. "I've cleaned private jets," she said. "They still land." The bartender set a glass down too loudly. Someone whispered near the terrace doors, and the whisper died as quickly as it was born. The clash was no longer about a book. It was about gravity, the pull of two philosophies testing which one could hold the room. Richard was used to being the strongest planet in any conversation, pulling orbits into his favor. Mary did not try to be a planet. She became instead a steady axis, and the room, unfamiliar with this kind of stillness, began to turn. He gestured broadly, reclaiming the air with practiced confidence. "Let me translate," he said to the guests. "We're witnessing a collision between fantasy and cash flow, between bedtime stories and balance sheets." He started walking again, as if motion itself could break the spell. "Tell me, Mary, what would you do if I took that book away? Would the answers vanish with it?" Her response came like a clear bell. "The answers are not the paper," she said. "They are what the words wake up." Her phrasing surprised him. It had a craft he didn't expect. Words wake up. The idea wandered through him, and he shut the door quickly. "Then wake them. Up somewhere else," he said, voice turning hard at the edges. "In this house, people are paid to perform tasks, not recite proverbs." She nodded. "I understand tasks." A pause. "But sometimes the most important tasks aren't on the list." He felt the faintest thread of irritation tug his composure. "And who decides that?" "Conscience," she answered. The word flicked a switch. Richard, who had spent years mastering the lighting of rooms, didn't like the light it cast. A guest, an executive who owed Richard more than a few favors, tried to recalibrate the mood. "Come on, Rich," he joked. "You can't compete with scripture in a debate. It's like arguing with a sunrise." Laughter returned, weak but obedient. Richard seized it quickly, raising his glass. "To sunrises," he said, "and the people who chase them because they can't handle the day." He sipped, eyes fixed on Mary over the rim. She didn't look away. "The day comes for everyone," she replied, "with or without the blinds closed." That line threaded itself into the air. You could feel it catch on something invisible in him. Behind the performance of power, there is always staging, a network of ropes and pulleys you aren't meant to see. Tonight, for a heartbeat, one of those ropes slipped into view. He masked it with a shrug. "Enough," he declared, efficient. "We have a celebration, not a sermon. If you want to keep working here, keep the book in your bag." "I don't hide it," she said. "It's part of my journey." He leaned in. Again, softer, almost paternal. "Mary, listen. You're a good worker, but there are rules to rooms like this. One of them is, don't bring your troubles to the table." She breathed in, the kind of breath you take before a decision that will alter the arc of a night. "I brought peace," she said. "You brought the table." There was no applause. No dramatic gasp, just a ripple of realization moving quietly through the audience. The clash had revealed something larger than insult or defense. It had unearthed a value system, his rooted in control, hers rooted in conviction. And in that unveiling, people saw the shape of their own compromises. Richard took a step back, as if distance could restore the hierarchy, as if the right angle of space could reset the scene. "If peace is what you brought," he said, "why does my house feel like a courtroom?" Mary studied him, not as a rival, but as a man trying to hold a heavy door closed with his shoulder. "Because truth asks questions," she answered, "and questions make noise on their way in." He exhaled, long and low, and for a fraction of a second there it was, the shadow of a memory across his face, a private reel playing behind the eyes. He sealed it quickly. "Then here's my answer," he said. "In this house, money is the language. Speak it, or be quiet." It should have ended the moment. It had ended moments like this before. But tonight, his words felt like a door slamming in a hallway where footsteps were already approaching. Mary looked down at the Bible, and when she lifted her head again, something resolute had settled. "Then let me say one sentence," she murmured, the syllables balanced like a glass of water in a moving car. "Not to argue, to name what's already here." Her voice did not rise. It simply found its place and held it. Richard didn't give permission. He didn't forbid it either. The guests' faces turned like sunflowers towards sound, and as Mary opened the book, the clash stopped being an exchange and became A threshold, the precise hinge where spectacle begins to give way to revelation, where the performance of power meets the first note of a verse that was never written to flatter kings, but to uncover what thrones cannot cover. The silence in the room thickened until it felt like even the chandeliers were listening. Richard had thrown his words like daggers, expecting them to stick, expecting Mary to flinch, lower her gaze, or clutch at an apology. Instead, she did something far more disarming. She simply held her Bible closer, pressing it gently against her chest, as though it were both shield and anchor. There was no trembling in her hands, no darting glance toward the exit. Her stillness carried more weight than any outburst could have. Richard wasn't used to that. His life had been built on reactions. He knew how to provoke them, control them, bend them to his advantage. In boardrooms, people stumbled over themselves to appease him. At home, staff scrambled at the sound of his voice. Even in public, the fear of disappointing Richard Thompson often outweighed the courage to oppose him. But Mary did not stumble. She did not scramble. She did not rush to soothe his pride. Her calmness was so steady, it began to unsettle him in ways he could not explain. "Why are you looking at me like that?" he asked suddenly, though her gaze was not accusatory. His tone was sharper now, more brittle than before. Mary didn't look away. "I'm not looking at you, sir. I'm looking at what you're carrying." The sentence landed with a strange resonance. Guests shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether she meant his glass of scotch, his expensive cufflinks, or something far less tangible. Richard let out a forced laugh, the kind that didn't travel beyond his throat. "And what do you think I'm carrying, Mary? Billions in assets? A reputation built from decades of decisions?" His voice rose slightly, as if daring her to challenge the inventory of his empire. Mary's reply was quiet, almost tender. "A weight you don't want anyone to see." The words weren't loud, but they carried through the room like an uninvited revelation. Richard froze for a fraction of a second, and that pause betrayed him. His eyes flickered, just once, just enough for those watching closely to sense a fracture behind the polished facade. It was the kind of slip a man like him couldn't afford, because it gave truth a crack to crawl through. Mary's silent strength was not born in this moment alone. It had been forged in years of unseen struggle. She had stood in hospital rooms where machines beeped against the silence of grief. She had waited on corners in the rain for buses that never came. She had walked into houses where people treated her like furniture, invisible unless something needed to be cleaned. Through it all, she had learned that silence was not weakness. Silence could be power when it carried the weight of conviction. And tonight, that power filled the room in a way Richard's arrogance could not overpower. He cleared his throat, trying to reset the balance, but the more he spoke, the less control he seemed to have. "You think you know me? You think holding that book gives you insight into my life?" His words cut sharply, but the edges no longer landed the way they once did. Guests began to notice the imbalance, his volume rising, hers steady, his face flushed, hers serene. Mary didn't argue. She didn't defend herself. She simply placed her fingers on the edge of the Bible, tracing the faded gold letters. "It's not about me knowing you," she said softly. "It's about truth knowing you." The phrase was simple, but it hit harder than any insult. Richard's smirk faltered. He wanted to dismiss it, to laugh it off, but the laughter caught somewhere in his chest. He was no longer battling a maid with a book. He was battling the reflection of his own conscience, mirrored back at him through her calmness. The guests felt it too. They weren't sure why they were so captivated, but something in the air told them they were witnessing more than a disagreement. They were witnessing a clash of worlds. Arrogance versus humility, wealth versus faith, noise versus stillness. And in that clash, it became clear that Mary's silent strength was bending the atmosphere itself. Richard stepped closer again, lowering his voice as though to reclaim intimacy. "You're brave for someone in your position," he whispered, a trace of menace threading his words. Mary's reply came, without hesitation. "It's not bravery," she said. "It's faith. and faith doesn't shrink when it's mocked. For the first time in years, Richard felt something he couldn't categorize, an unease that no decision, no investment, no transaction had ever stirred in him. He told himself it was irritation, but deep down, he knew it was something closer to fear. Fear of being seen, fear of being exposed, fear that this quiet woman, with nothing but a worn Bible and an unshakable spirit, might pierce through the armor he had spent decades forging. The silence stretched again, and with each second it grew heavier. Mary wasn't filling it with arguments or explanations. She was letting it work on him, letting the imbalance reveal itself. And as Richard tried to meet her gaze, he realized that arrogance had no script for moments like this. He could dominate a negotiation, command a stage, silence a boardroom, but he couldn't silence someone whose strength came not from pride, but from peace. The weight of that realization pressed into him like a truth he couldn't dismiss, and though he would never admit it out loud, Richard felt the ground beneath his confidence begin to tremble, setting the stage for the words Mary was about to speak next. The weight in the room became almost unbearable. Richard shifted in his stance, trying to reclaim dominance with his posture, but even his carefully honed body language seemed to falter against the quiet force that radiated from Mary. She didn't raise her voice, didn't move to the center of attention, and yet every eye found its way back to her. Slowly, she opened the Bible, the fragile spine creaking as though it had been waiting for this very moment. Her hands trembled at first, but not from fear, from the enormity of what she was about to release into the air. The guests leaned in, some with curiosity, others with discomfort. Richard himself tilted his chin up, amused but uneasy, trying to mask his growing tension behind a smirk. He had expected silence from her, not words, and certainly not words drawn from a book he had mocked so often. Mary's eyes moved across the page, searching, and then her lips parted. Her voice, soft at first, carried through the space with an uncanny clarity. "For what shall it profit a man, if he shall gain the whole world and lose his own soul?" The verse hung in the room like a verdict. A few guests lowered their glasses. Others exchanged nervous glances. Richard's jaw tightened. It was a verse he had heard before, perhaps long ago, in a church he hadn't stepped into since his youth. But tonight, in his mansion, spoken by a maid with no wealth, no power, and no stake in his empire, the words sliced through his armor like a blade slipping between the cracks. Mary's voice trembled on the first line, but as she continued, something shifted. It grew steadier, deeper, carrying an authority that seemed larger than her frame. "There is nothing hidden that will not be disclosed, nothing concealed that will not be brought out into the open." A murmur traveled through the guests. Some looked directly at Richard now, unconsciously connecting the verse with the man before them. He laughed suddenly, sharp and dismissive, hoping to break the tension. "Convenient," he said, clapping his hands once. "The maid comes with riddles. You sound like one of those street preachers in Times Square." Mary did not stop. She read another line, her voice firmer. "The love of money is the root of all evil, and some, craving it, have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs." Her voice didn't crack this time. The steadiness unsettled him more than any raised tone could. Richard's chest tightened. The words weren't new, but tonight they landed differently, like they had been aimed at him, written with his life in mind. His temples throbbed, as if memory itself had been dragged into the light. "Enough," he muttered, but the word sounded smaller than he intended. He picked up his glass, took a sip, and set it back down too quickly. The crystal rang out like a bell, and silence followed. Mary closed the book slightly, not snapping it shut, but holding her finger between the pages as a placeholder. Her eyes lifted, not in defiance, but in calm observation. "These words aren't mine," she said gently. "They're truth, and truth always has a way of finding us." The guests felt the shift. Something unseen had crossed into the room, something that didn't belong to Richard's wealth or Mary's position. It was a presence that made every corner feel smaller, as though no one could hide behind champagne or chandeliers. Richard forced another laugh. "You think this is about me? You think I'm afraid of a verse from a book?" His tone was loud, but it carried strain. "Let me tell you something. My life is built on results. Hard numbers, signed contracts, billions. I've buried the past, and nothing brings it back." Mary's voice remained steady, a counterpoint to his unraveling. "Secrets don't stay buried forever," she said, her tone neither accusing nor apologizing. "Sometimes all it takes is a word to remind us of what we've tried to forget." The phrase seemed to strike a hidden chord. Richard's expression faltered. For a second his eyes betrayed something, fear maybe, or recognition. He turned away toward the window, as though the glittering skyline might shield him from the verse, still echoing in his ears. Behind him Mary lowered her gaze to the Bible once more, as if the book itself had chosen the words she spoke. Her calmness, her refusal to waver, became more powerful than any performance Richard could muster. The guests sensed it. The balance of the room had shifted. Where once Richard's arrogance dictated the atmosphere, now Mary's unshaken faith drew the gravity. Every heartbeat in that room seemed to wait for what might come next, for the next revelation that could no longer be ignored. Richard's laughter faded too quickly, and the space it left behind was filled by something heavier than silence. The words Mary had spoken clung to the walls of the room, refusing to dissolve like smoke. For the guests, it was uncomfortable. For Richard, it was unbearable. His face, once so carefully composed, betrayed him with small shifts, the tightening of his jaw, the narrowing of his eyes, the way his hand gripped the edge of the grand piano as if he needed the wood to steady him. The mask he had worn for decades, crafted through boardroom battles, public appearances, and magazine covers, began to crack. Because the verses Mary had read weren't abstract to him. They weren't distant moral warnings meant for someone else. They struck directly at the one part of his life he had buried so deeply he pretended it didn't exist. Years earlier, before the empire, before the glossy interviews and the endless accolades, there had been a scandal. It was not in the headlines, not in the public record, because Richard had used every resource, every dollar, and every connection to bury it. But buried doesn't mean erased. Buried means hidden, and hidden truths don't lose their weight. They grow heavier, pressing down harder with every passing year. The words, "nothing concealed that will not be brought out into the open," replayed in his mind like a hammer on metal. They carried him back to nights he had tried to forget, nights when he sat in a small office with only a single lamp on, staring at documents he should have destroyed, numbers that should never have existed. It was a financial decision he had made early in his career, one that hurt people he told himself were just collateral. He remembered the faces of employees who lost their jobs when he manipulated a deal to save his own reputation. The way he signed papers with a pen that shook just slightly in his hand, convincing himself it was necessary. He told himself then that it was just business, that the impact didn't matter as long as he survived. But deep down, he knew he had crossed a line. And now, in his own mansion, in front of guests who only knew him as a titan of industry, a maid was reading words that exposed the one truth he had worked his whole life to hide, that his empire was built on choices he could never justify if they came into the light. His throat tightened, and for the first time in years, he felt the sting of shame. Mary didn't know the details. She wasn't pointing a finger or laying out evidence, but the verses she spoke had the uncanny power to pierce through pretense. They spoke of greed, of the danger of craving wealth at the cost of one's soul, of secrets that always come to the surface. Each line seemed designed for him, as though the book had been waiting to be opened in this room, on this night, and that terrified him more than any accusation could. Richard tried to hide it, but his guests noticed. They weren't blind to the shift in his face, the sudden absence of his usual smug composure, People who had admired his confidence began to see something else, something human, something vulnerable. The man who mocked weakness now stood on the edge of being exposed by it. One of the women near the fireplace whispered, "He looks pale," and the words rippled softly across the crowd. Richard forced a grin, but it didn't reach his eyes. He straightened, loosening his tie as if the room had grown warmer. "This is nonsense," he said, his voice harsher than he intended. "Words on a page don't change reality. They don't rewrite history." His gaze flicked toward Mary, sharp, defensive. "Do you really think some verse applies to me, to my life? Look around. This is reality. This is what matters." But even as he spoke, he knew the words rang hollow. His mind wouldn't stop pulling him backward, back to that office, back to the choices he had buried. And if he was honest, it wasn't just one mistake. It was a pattern. Lies told, deals manipulated, people discarded. The Bible in. Mary's hands had become a mirror, reflecting not his wealth but the cost of it. Mary closed the Bible gently, her finger still marking the page. She didn't raise her voice or challenge him directly. She simply looked at him with eyes that held no judgment, only truth. "History doesn't disappear just because you've hidden it," she said softly. "And reality isn't only what we build, it's also what we carry." Her calmness cut deeper than anger could have. The guests shifted uneasily, sensing that something unseen was unfolding. They didn't know the specifics, but they felt the weight of it, the way Richard's arrogance was collapsing under guilt, the way his defenses looked less like power and more like fear. He turned abruptly toward the window, as if the Manhattan skyline could save him. The lights outside shimmered in the glass, but instead of reflecting power, they seemed to highlight the emptiness he felt. His journey, the decisions that had once seemed so brilliant, now replayed in his mind like a reel of revelations he had never wanted to face. He whispered, almost to himself, "No one knows. No one was supposed to know." But in that moment, everyone in the room knew something. They didn't need details. They could see it in his face, in his unraveling composure. They saw a man haunted by something larger than wealth could cover, and Mary, standing quietly with the Bible still in her hands, knew the verses had done what they always did when spoken with conviction. They had uncovered the hidden truth, dragging it from the shadows into the light, setting the stage for what no one in that room was prepared to witness next. The room's grandeur couldn't protect him anymore. It was as if the verse had reached into the scaffolding behind the scenes and yanked out the pin that held his performance together. Richard opened his mouth to speak. Habit, reflex, the trained instinct of a man who always sees control with the next line. But nothing came. The words stuck, thick and useless, and the pause that followed was longer than all his carefully calculated silences put together. He coughed softly, then tried to reshape his face into a smile that looked more like a wince. The mask he'd worn for years had been skillfully lacquered with achievement, but lacquer cracks when heat finds it. Tonight, heat had a voice. He reached for the piano again, fingertips grazing the lid, as though touch could summon authority. He looked bigger, beside that grand instrument ours. Ago. Now the piano seemed to dwarf him, a black mirror reflecting a man who had lost his place in his own script. "Enough," he managed, but the sound barely crossed the space between him and Mary. The syllables fell flat, unpersuasive even to his own ears. He cleared his throat like a judge about to restore order. No order returned. Mary didn't lean into his weakness, and that made her stronger. She lowered her eyes for a breath, as if respecting the weight of what had just happened, and then lifted them again with the same calm that had carried her through rooms like this for years. Her hands rested gently on the Bible, one finger still holding the verse open, as if to say the page would be here whenever truth was ready to be heard. "I'm not here to hurt you," she said, quiet enough that the room leaned in to borrow the sound. "I'm here because words find us when we need them." Richard swallowed hard. His vision tunneled toward the terrace doors, toward the alive city and its traffic and the noise that had always rescued him from reflection, but noise can't outpace a sentence that lands in the conscience. He blinked, and a sheen gathered across his eyes he refused to call tears. He forced air into his lungs, measured, then sharper. "You don't know me," he said, trying to rediscover that old rhythm, the cadence of a closing argument. "You don't know what it takes to build a life like this." He gestured around the room, a grand arc meant to summon witnesses. The chandelier, the art, the skyline. None testified on cue. Mary's answer carried no triumph. "I don't have to know your resume to recognize a weight." Her voice was steady, humble, almost tender. "You're not the only one who's carried one." She didn't move closer. She let the space speak. "I know what it's like to beg for sleep and fear the quiet when it comes." That acknowledgement cracked something he'd kept locked. It wasn't accusation. Accusation he could have fought. Compassion leaves no place. To swing. He looked at her uniform, simple and clean, and at the old leather of the Bible. He saw, in an instant, the long corridor of his own decisions, nights of shortcuts and sign-offs, the hidden truth he'd filed under justification, the journey he had sold to himself as necessary. He saw the mindset he'd cultivated, the one that called remorse a weakness and called velocity a virtue. He had sprinted past the places where apology lived. Now the sprint had run him into a wall. A tremor worked. Down his jaw. He closed his eyes. He tried one more time to stitch together authority from habit. "This is a party," he said, a faint echo of a line he'd used to reset dozens of rooms. This is... His voice thinned. The sentence couldn't decide what it wanted to be. He dropped it. An executive near the bar set his glass down with a softness that sounded like respect. Another guest, someone who normally laughed at every safe moment, didn't laugh. You could feel the recalibration of the audience in real time, their admiration pivoting to something new, something more demanding than charm. Empathy, power, stripped of its costume, often shrinks into something near to boyhood. That's what happened to Richard. The man who had dismissed people as line items looked suddenly painfully young. The way someone looks when truth corners them and they have to choose between defiance and surrender. He rubbed the bridge of his nose. Through teeth that wanted to clench, he forced a whisper. "I did what I had to do." The justification sounded smaller in the open air than it ever had in his head. "I built this from nothing." He gestured again, but the sweep of his arm was tired now. No one helped me. Nobody." The last word reached back toward a kitchen table in Queens, where a boy learned that silence could be safer than hope. He blinked again, and a tear threatened. He swallowed it back. Mary nodded once, almost imperceptibly, as if recognizing a mile marker on a map she'd walked. "I believe you worked hard," she said. "Hard work doesn't erase harm, but it can begin repair." She was not letting him off the hook. She was offering him a path. "It can begin transformation." He flinched at that word. Transformation to him had meant acquisition, esteem, photographs at charity galas, where he stood under banners that borrowed the language of goodness. The kind of transformation she meant was different. Not a portfolio update, but a re-aiming of the self. Not strategy, and conscience, not expansion, but confession. He felt the shape of it in his chest and pushed against it, because pushing had always worked. It didn't move. He tried to pivot to anger because anger was firmer ground. "You don't get to come in here and..." The sentence halted when he caught his reflection in the piano's gloss. The cut of the suit, perfect. The eyes, rimmed with the admission he would not give. "I'm not the villain you think I am," he said, softer now, almost pleading with the mirror. "I took risks others were too afraid to take. I was decisive." He had always loved that word, decisive. Tonight it sounded like a mask falling down a staircase. Mary did not answer immediately. She let his words settle where they wanted. Then, "Decisions show us who we are," she said, "but they don't have to be the end of the story." She lifted the Bible a fraction. Not high, not dramatic. Sometimes a story changes in one paragraph. He shook his head with a helpless private motion. "You think a paragraph can fix what I've done?" His throat caught. You think a verse can pay back what was taken? There it was, the first open admission, if not of specifics, then of scale. The guests felt it as a current, quiet and undeniable. The room became holy ground, not because of marble, but because someone finally stopped running. Mary's gaze warmed, not with pity, but with that rare dignity that only the honest grant each other. "I don't think words erase what happened," she said. "I think they, and tell the truth about where to start." She looked at the page again, then at him. "And I think you already know where that is." He gripped the back of a chair to steady himself. Pride rose up one more time, a wave from old training. He almost said, "Who are you to tell me anything?" But he didn't. The sentence died on the shore of the look in her eyes. It was the look people wear when they have survived, when they have walked through nights much longer than this one and woken up able to be gentle. Anyway, that kind of gentleness disarms empires. The chandelier's light blurred at the edges. He blinked hard, and a single tear gathered, balanced dangerously, then retreated. He wouldn't let it fall, not here, not yet, but everyone saw that it could. He felt the room watch him, not as an audience waiting for a spectacle, but as witnesses to something fragile. He hated being seen this way and needed it in equal measure, like a man who resents medicine and reaches for it anyway. He eased himself onto the piano bench as if his knees didn't trust him. His hands hovered over the keys, then lowered to his lap, useless. "I don't know how to undo it," he said, the confession barely audible. "I don't know how to carry it anymore." The admission, simple and human, landed like a bell that doesn't clang so much as hum, the sound moving through bone. Mary exhaled just once, and it felt like the room could breathe with her. "Then stop carrying it alone," she said. "That's where people break." She could have said more. She didn't. She understood that when shame is fresh, advice can feel like sand in a wound. She chose mercy over momentum. Time rearranged itself. The party had become a pause in somebody's life, a place where the old mindset failed, and a new one hadn't formed yet. This is what the hinge of transformation looks like. No spotlight, no speech, just a man sitting down because standing has become too much to fake. He looked up at her, eyes rimmed with that same, almost tear, and asked the question men like him are trained never to ask. "What do I do?" It surprised him as much as anyone. The room didn't stir. A waiter near the doorway went completely still. Outside, a siren passed on Fifth Avenue and blurred into the distance, as if the world were politely stepping away to give this moment room. Mary didn't rush the answer. "Tell the truth," she said. "Not to save your image, to save your soul." She glanced at the guests, not to shame him, but to include them in the possibility that this was not just his reckoning. "And make it right where you can. That's the beginning of repair." A muscle in his cheek fluttered. Repair. The word came with both weight and relief. He had paid for restorations of paintings hung along his hallways. He had watched conservators with small brushes lean close to erase years of grime without damaging what was written underneath. This would be like that, he realized, except the canvas was his life. He had been so intent on armor that he'd forgotten how to heal. His control tried a final trick, humor as exit ramp. "You make it sound simple," he said, aiming for wry and landing on weary. "It isn't simple." Mary shook her head. "No," she answered, and the gentleness in the word kept it from being a scold. "It's not simple. It's right." She closed the Bible halfway, the page still marked, as if to say the verse wasn't done yet, only resting. The guests stood inside the hum of what had just happened. Some looked at their shoes, reconsidering the math they used to calculate worth. Some examined the art without seeing it, their thoughts elsewhere, journeying back over their own decisions. The impact of the moment wasn't theatrical, it was cellular, a quiet recalibration of what power means when truth steps into the room. Richard wiped his palms on his trousers and stared at the city again. The skyline hadn't changed. He had, not completely, not cleanly, but enough that the distance between who he was and who he could be looked for the first time traversable. He didn't trust the path yet. He recognized it. "I don't know who I am without the armor," he admitted, voice sanded down to honesty. "I don't know who I am if I'm not the one who wins." The sentence sounded like a child lost in a store, realizing every aisle looks the same until someone calls their name. Mary held his gaze. "You're still the one who decides," she said, "but this time, decide to be true." A fresh wave of shame rose in him, and with it a braver thing, the first contour of remorse. He felt in a way he could not intellectualize that remorse is not a cage, but a gate. It confines the old life and opens to a new one at the same time. He pressed a knuckle to his lips and nodded once, a small movement that meant more than any vow he could have crafted. He wasn't ready for grand statements. He was ready for the next honest breath. Mary stepped back just enough to release him from the press of eyes, to give him the dignity of space. She didn't celebrate. She didn't claim victory. Quiet courage doesn't keep score. The chasm between his arrogance and her steadiness had narrowed, not closed, not yet, but narrowed enough that a bridge could imagine itself there. A clock somewhere in the house ticked with the old, unbothered rhythm of seconds. Outside, the city kept being the city. Inside, the verse kept being the verse. Richard's shoulders eased, only a little, as if a fraction of the weight had shifted to a place that could hold it. "I can hear the room breathing," he said unexpectedly, almost to himself. "It's like everything got louder and quieter at the same time." Mary answered in a whisper that belonged to both of them. "That's what it sounds like when truth arrives." He nodded again, and another almost tear nearly crossed the edge, and didn't. He set his hands on the piano keys, not to play, but to steady. The gesture felt like a promise to himself. Hands meant for control, learning how to be still. What came next would require something he had not practiced in years, humility that acts. But first, a man has to make peace with the sound of his own honesty. He listened to it now, tentative, raw, real, as the night prepared to turn the page. Mary lowered the Bible slowly, her hand closing it with the gentleness of someone who knew the weight of silence could do what words often fail to achieve. She did not rush to explain, did not add a single phrase to soften the edge of what had just been spoken. The leather covers touched, the faint sound of the book shutting resonating louder than any applause, louder than the chatter of guests, louder even than Richard's attempt to collect himself. It was a final period placed at the end of sentences that refused to be ignored. The silence that followed did not feel empty. It carried density, a kind of pressure that bent the air in the room. No one dared to move. Glasses remained half-raised, breath stayed shallow, eyes hovered between Mary and Richard, as though waiting for one of them to signal what came next. But Mary offered nothing more than quiet presence. Her strength had never been in quantity, but in the quality of her conviction. And conviction, left to stand alone, filled the room like a cathedral bell ringing in the dark. Richard's chest heaved as if he had been sprinting. He leaned forward slightly, elbows pressing against his knees, his shoulders no longer squared like a general before troops, but slouched like a man, exhausted from carrying armor too long. The chandelier's light caught on the moisture gathering at the corners of his eyes, and he blinked quickly, hoping no one noticed, yet everyone did. Tears don't need to fall to betray themselves. His face had shifted from defiance to something rawer, stripped of performance. For the first time in decades, Richard Thompson looked small, not in stature, but in pretense. Inside him, memory had staged a rebellion. He could still hear the verse echoing, each line replaying against the reel of his past. He thought of a young man signing away lives in an office, lit only by the glow of a desk lamp, of broken promises he had covered with bonuses, of the lies he had told himself to justify each decision. He had repeated the mantra for years: results matter, people adapt, survival requires sacrifice. But Mary's words had unstitched that mantra, exposing the wound beneath. He had built a fortress of wealth, but tonight he realized it was glass, fragile, against the hammer of truth. He opened his mouth, but arrogance refused to come. Pride had abandoned him. What slipped out instead was a whisper, so soft it almost dissolved into the silence. "I'm sorry." The words startled him as much as anyone else. Richard Thompson did not apologize, not to competitors, not to employees, not to family, not even to himself. But here they were, trembling on his lips, falling into the space between him and a maid who had asked for nothing but respect for her faith. His apology wasn't loud, wasn't rehearsed, but its sincerity made it louder than any speech he had ever given. Mary did not smile. She did not nod in victory. She simply stood there, holding her Bible, steady as ever. The absence of triumph in her expression turned his apology into something real. He wasn't excused. He wasn't absolved. He was seen, and being seen in all his brokenness was both humiliating and redemptive. The guests exchanged uncertain glances. They had come expecting celebration, not confession. They were used to Richard as the man who dominated conversations, who cracked jokes that made others follow with polite laughter, who could pivot any awkwardness into a performance of control. Tonight, they witnessed something no headline had prepared them for, the collapse of arrogance under the weight of conscience. Some felt pity, others unease, but all of them sensed the impact of this moment. They were watching the beginning of something, not an ending, but a transformation no one had scripted. Richard rubbed his palms together, restless, the sound of skin on skin filling the quiet. He whispered again, barely audible, "I'm sorry." This time, it wasn't just to Mary. It was to ghosts in his memory, to people he had wronged, to the version of himself he had buried. His voice cracked on the second word, and he let the crack stay. For years, he had believed fortune could shield him from shame. He had built towers of investments, draped himself in authority, armed himself with decisions and strategies meant to insulate him from weakness. But weakness wasn't the enemy. It was dishonesty, pride, and the refusal to face truth that had enslaved him. Mary had revealed that without accusation, without fury, without theatrics. She had simply held her ground, her Bible, and her faith, and that had been enough to unravel him. A guest near the fireplace set his drink down quietly, the sound almost reverent. Another brushed a tear away discreetly. Though no one would admit it later, the room itself seemed changed, as if marble and glass and chandeliers had become mere decorations to something far greater than wealth. Everyone could feel it. Humility had entered the space, and humility had more power than fortune ever could. Richard lifted his face again, the sheen of shame still present, but with something new mixed into it, a strange kind of relief. The fortress had cracked, but inside the cracks he felt air, light, the possibility of freedom. He realized that the apology, fragile as it was, marked the first honest decision he had made in years. It was the first step of a journey he didn't fully understand, but could no longer deny. "I thought I was untouchable," he whispered, half to himself, half to Mary. "I thought I could bury it all, but I can't." He shook his head slowly, the movement weighted with revelations. "It's still here. It never left." Mary's voice was calm, her tone free of accusation. "Truth doesn't leave," she said, "but neither does mercy." The words settled into him like water into dry ground. He didn't know what mercy looked like yet. He didn't know how to repair, how to face what he had done, how to walk through the wreckage of choices without collapsing under it. But for the first time he was willing to imagine it, and in that willingness, redemption began, not complete, not clean, but real. The silence remained, but now it was different. It wasn't heavy with shame anymore. It was alive with possibility. The air itself seemed to hum with the tension between who Richard had been and who he might become. His guests shifted uneasily, sensing they were in the presence of something larger than wealth or scandal. Mary, Bible still in her hands, remained the quiet axis around which the room turned. And as Richard lowered his head again, whispering yet another apology into the hush, the knight's narrative turned toward the first fragile steps of humility, opening the way for what no one in that mansion expected to unfold next. The atmosphere inside the mansion had shifted into something fragile, almost sacred. The echoes of Richard's whispered apology still lingered in the air, and no one dared to disturb them. The same man who hours ago had filled the room with laughter that demanded agreement now sat with his head bowed, stripped of the performance that had shielded him for so long. For the first time, his guests were not looking at a millionaire or at an empire wrapped in glass and steel. They were looking at a man, and that alone felt like a revelation. Mary had not moved closer, nor had she attempted to console him with hollow reassurances. She understood that silence was doing the work now. Truth had been spoken, and once it finds its way into the open, it doesn't need help to stay alive. She simply held her Bible close, her expression steady, a reminder that faith didn't need applause to prove its strength. The contrast was unmistakable. A woman with no fortune, no social standing, no name on the city's lips, now holding the kind of authority that wealth could never buy. Richard lifted his eyes for a moment, scanning the room that had always belonged to him. He had chosen every painting, every sculpture, every polished surface to reflect control, prestige, permanence. But in this silence, they looked different, fragile, almost unnecessary. He whispered again, his voice hollowed out of pride. "I thought power meant never needing to bow." He shook, his head slightly, almost in disbelief at his own words. "But I see now, I've been bowing to the wrong things." Mary didn't reply, but her gaze carried the answer, and the guests, though silent, felt the weight of his confession. They understood something they couldn't put into words, that they had all been bowing to something too, whether to fear or ambition or the invisible chains of expectation. Watching Richard crumble wasn't just about him. It was about them, about the way arrogance could be peeled back to reveal the fragile human heart underneath. The impact of that realization was undeniable. Every person present would carry it beyond the walls of that mansion. They would remember the sound of a voice cracking under truth, the sight of a man's mask collapsing under the pressure of a verse. They would recall how it felt when the power dynamics they had always accepted as immovable suddenly turned upside down. That memory would follow them like a shadow, long after the chandeliers dimmed. And within Richard, a transformation had already begun, however small, however tentative. He didn't know the shape of redemption, but he had caught the first glimpse of it, like a light flickering at the end of a long corridor. His wealth could not erase his hidden truths, but his willingness to face them might begin to write a different ending to the story. The first step toward humility had been taken, and though shaky, it was real. Mary's presence reminded everyone of something easy to forget in a world obsessed with volume and spectacle. Sometimes the strongest voices are not the loudest ones. Sometimes truth comes not from power, but from faith and courage. And when arrogance meets humility, shame has no place to hide. The night did not end with applause or fanfare. It ended with quiet, with reflection, with the unsettled awareness that each person in that room had witnessed more than a clash between a millionaire and a maid. They had witnessed the moment when truth refused to stay buried, when conscience rose above pretense, and when dignity outshined wealth. And as Richard sat still, unable to disguise the tear that finally slid down his cheek, the story hung open, unfinished, preparing to lead all who watched into the next chapter of this unexpected journey. And if you've walked with me all the way to this point, maybe something in this story spoke to you in a way you didn't expect. If it did, leave a sign in the comments. Something simple like, "I'm with you until the end," or "This message was for me." I'd love to know who stayed through to the last moment. If the story touched you, a like on this video goes a long way in keeping these reflections alive and reaching others who might need them too. And if you feel these kinds of narratives belong in your life, subscribing, is the best way to stay close. We'll keep uncovering lessons, one story at a time. And since this conversation doesn't have to stop here, there's a video right next to this one that continues in the same spirit. Click and come with me there. Let's keep walking through these stories together.